Thomas E. Blanton, Jr. On a quiet Sunday morning, September 15, 1963, the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, should have been a place of peace, of worship, and of community. Instead, it became the site of one of the most heinous acts of domestic terrorism in American history. 4 young African-American girls, Denise McNair, aged 11, and 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, lost their lives in an explosion so powerful it shook the very foundations of a city already rife with racial tension. The perpetrator of this act, Thomas E. Blanton, Jr., a member of the Ku Klux Klan, had planted 19 sticks of dynamite in the church basement. The blast killed the girls instantly and injured more than 20 others, leaving a hole in the church's rear wall, shattered windows, destroyed cars, and a community traumatized by the indiscriminate violence of hatred. The bombing, targeted at a central hub of the civil rights movement, was not just an attack on a building, but a symbolic strike against progress, against equality, and against the innocence of 4 young lives. The church itself had long been more than a house of worship. For Birmingham's African-American community, it was a sanctuary, a place of gathering, a meeting point for civil rights leaders, and a center for youth education and activism. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered speeches there, and the church had served as headquarters for organizing protests against segregation. To strike at the 16th Street Baptist Church was to strike at the heart of the civil rights movement. And that morning, Thomas Blanton and his co-conspirators, Robert Edward Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, and Herman Frank Cash, did exactly that. While Chambliss had gained notoriety as Dynamite Bob, it was Blanton who would decades later be brought to justice for his role in the massacre. The investigation into the bombing was fraught with obstacles and deliberate obstruction. Although the FBI quickly identified the main suspects, the agency, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, blocked the prosecution of Blanton and others in 1965, despite recommendations from field agents who had gathered substantial evidence. Hoover's decision effectively stalled justice for decades, leaving the victims' families in a limbo of grief and unanswered questions. Over the years, the case was reopened multiple times, but it was not until 1993 that the investigation gained real momentum, largely due to the determined efforts of U.S. Attorney Doug Jones and the persistent advocacy of the victims' families. By 2000, authorities charged Thomas Blanton Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry, finally setting the stage for a trial that would bring a long-delayed reckoning for a crime that had shocked the nation. The trial of Thomas Blanton Jr. in 2001 was a study in contrasts between the horrors of history and the pursuit of justice in the present. Blanton, by then 62, faced charges of first-degree murder for the deaths of the 4 girls. His courtroom was a place heavy with emotion, and the prosecution, led by Doug Jones, meticulously laid out a case built on decades-old evidence, circumstantial testimony, and crucially, secretly recorded FBI tapes. These tapes, recorded in 1964 and 1965 through bugged microphones in Blanton's apartment and the trunk of an informant's car, captured conversations in which Blanton spoke of the planning and preparation for the bombing. Though he never explicitly admitted to carrying out the act, his incriminating words painted a chilling picture of premeditated hatred. Witnesses included the grieving parents of the victims, former FBI agents, and others who testified to Blanton's fervent involvement in the Ku Klux Klan and his deep-seated racial animosity. Blanton's defense attorney, John C. Robbins, tried to distance his client from the historical significance of the bombing and to urge the jury to focus solely on the evidence presented. He acknowledged Blanton's racist views, but argued that the case was entirely circumstantial, pointing to flaws in witnesses' memories and questioning the reliability of certain testimonies. Blanton himself did not take the stand, and the defense called only 2 witnesses, making it clear that the prosecution's narrative, supported by the FBI tapes, would dominate the jury's perception. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury deliberated for just over 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all 4 counts of murder. The swift decision reflected the power of the evidence and the moral clarity with which the jurors approached the case. Thomas Blanton Jr. was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, a symbolic and tangible measure of justice finally served. The courtroom reaction was deeply human and profoundly emotional. One juror wept as the forewoman, a middle-aged black woman, read the verdict aloud. Blanton's eyes were reported to have grown moist as he was led away in handcuffs, his lawyer immediately indicating plans to appeal. Outside the courthouse, the news was met with spontaneous celebration from motorists, honking and cheering, while church leaders and members of the community expressed relief that justice, though delayed by decades, had been rendered. Reverend Abraham Lincoln Woods, a leading figure in Birmingham's black community, described the verdict as a statement of progress and moral accountability. For families like those of Denise McNair and Carol Robertson, the conviction represented a measure of closure in a story marred by racial violence and institutional failure. The legacy of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing extends beyond the courtroom. The event, and the delayed justice for Blanton and his co-conspirators, has left an indelible mark on American history and culture. Songs like Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddam and Joan Baez's Birmingham Sunday, as well as literary works such as Christopher Paul Curtis's The Watsons Go to Birmingham, 1963, memorialize the tragedy and its victims. Spike Lee's documentary, Four Little Girls, further preserved the story for contemporary audiences, reminding the world of the cost of hate and the importance of vigilance against racial violence. The church itself remains a symbol of resilience and remembrance, a place where the past is honored and the lives of the 4 girls are celebrated for their potential. Cut tragically short, but never forgotten. The Blanton trial also underscores the persistence of justice in the face of systemic failure. While the FBI initially obstructed prosecution and the wheels of law turned slowly for decades, the ultimate conviction demonstrates that time cannot fully shield those responsible for atrocities. The bravery and determination of prosecutors like Doug Jones, combined with the unwavering advocacy of the victims' families, exemplify how persistence, moral courage, and careful legal work can eventually bring even the most elusive perpetrators to account. The case is a reminder that even decades after the fact, the pursuit of justice, grounded in evidence and ethical responsibility, can prevail. Robert Edward Chambliss. Robert Edward Chambliss, known infamously as Dynamite Bob, was a man whose ordinary appearance masked a violent allegiance to hatred and terror. Born on January 14, 1904, Chambliss worked as a truck driver for an auto parts company, a seemingly mundane life that belied the darkness within. By the age of 20, he had joined the Ku Klux Klan, embracing an ideology that would drive him to commit acts of terror against African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama, for decades. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, and early 1960s, Chambliss participated in firebombings targeting black families, leaving a trail of fear and destruction that escalated over time. His most notorious act, however, would be the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church on September 15, 1963, a crime that would claim the lives of 4 innocent young girls and shock the nation. On that fateful Sunday morning, Chambliss and his co-conspirators carefully planted 19 sticks of dynamite beneath the steps of the church, intending to strike fear into the heart of the African American community. The church was a central hub for the civil rights movement, hosting rallies and speeches by leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., and serving as a symbol of resistance against segregation. That morning, 5 girls were preparing for their choir rehearsal in the church basement, oblivious to the deadly plot unfolding above them. At 10:19 a.m., the bomb detonated, instantly killing 4 girls, 11-year-old Denise McNair and 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, and injuring 20 others. The explosion tore a hole in the east side of the building, shattered windows and doors, and filled the air with dust and smoke. Families and neighbors scrambled through the debris in a desperate search for survivors, only to find the lifeless bodies of the children, their young lives extinguished in an act of hatred. Denise McNair, known affectionately as Neeti, was a bright and spirited child who loved hosting plays and raising money for charitable causes. Cynthia Wesley, an adopted daughter of teachers, excelled in academics and music, known for her generosity and the parties she held for friends. Carol Robertson, a straight-A student, choir singer, and Girl Scout, mirrored her mother's love for reading and music, leaving behind a legacy that would inspire the creation of a learning center in her name. Addie Mae Collins, the eldest of 7 siblings, was a peacemaker and avid softball player, remembered for her kindness and active participation in community activities. The horror of their deaths was compounded by the realization that the bombing was not an isolated incident. It was part of a deliberate campaign to intimidate those who supported racial equality. In the immediate aftermath, outrage and grief swept through Birmingham, spilling over into violent confrontations. 2 more African-American youths lost their lives that same day. 16-year-old Johnny Robinson was shot by police after throwing stones at white motorists, and 13-year-old Virgil Ware was killed by 2 white teenagers on a motor scooter. The city was gripped by fear and sorrow, and former Birmingham Police Commissioner Bull Connor inflamed tensions further by suggesting that the Supreme Court and civil rights activists bore responsibility for the deaths, even implying that African Americans might have staged the bombing to provoke public outrage. Despite the clear evidence of Chambliss's involvement, justice did not come swiftly. He was initially arrested for possession of 122 sticks of dynamite without a permit, and was later charged with the murders. In October 1963, Chambliss was acquitted of murder, but fined and jailed briefly for the dynamite possession. The FBI had accumulated evidence implicating him and his accomplices, Bobby Frank Cherry, Thomas E. Blanton Jr., Towam, and Herman Frank Cash, but Director J. Edgar Hoover suppressed the information, preventing prosecutors from acting on it. For more than a decade, Chambliss remained unpunished for the deaths of the 4 girls. It was not until 1971 that Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley reopened the case, determined to hold the perpetrators accountable. By November 18, 1977, after decades of evasion, Chambliss, then 73 years old, was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died in an Alabama prison on October 29, 1985, still proclaiming his innocence, but the lives he destroyed were undeniable. Bobby Frank Cherry. Bobby Frank Cherry, born on June 20, 1930, in Mineral Springs, Alabama, would become one of the most infamous figures in the violent history of the Ku Klux Klan, a man whose actions left an indelible scar on the civil rights movement in the United States. Known among white supremacist circles as a dedicated member of the United Klans of America, Cherry's life was intertwined with hate, violence, and the belief that terror could preserve a racially segregated South. He was a man whose outwardly ordinary life working as a truck driver, welder, and cab driver hid the depths of his ideological extremism and capacity for cold-blooded murder. It was his connection to one of the most notorious acts of domestic terrorism in American history, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, that would ultimately define his legacy, leading to his conviction in 2002 decades after the crime had shocked the nation. On a quiet Sunday morning, September 15, 1963, Cherry, along with 3 other Klan members, executed a plan that would claim the lives of 4 innocent African-American girls, an attack meant to intimidate a community and strike fear into the heart of the civil rights movement. Cherry planted 19 sticks of dynamite in the church basement, a space where young girls were preparing for the Sunday service. Among the victims were 11-year-old Denise McNair and 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. Their deaths, the result of senseless racial hatred, would resonate across the nation and mark a turning point in the fight for civil rights. The explosion tore through the church at 10:19 a.m., collapsing the lower floor and leaving a scene of devastation. Windows were blown out, walls cracked, and debris littered the streets as the community scrambled to rescue the injured and recover the bodies of the young victims. The horror was compounded by the fact that the church had long been a beacon for the African American community, serving as a meeting place for rallies, protests, and speeches, including appearances by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It was a symbolic target, chosen deliberately to send a message that those who challenged the established racial order could expect violence in return. In the immediate aftermath, outrage and grief swept through Birmingham and beyond. People of all races mourned the loss of the 4 girls, attending funerals in the thousands, where the pain of the African American community was acknowledged by white citizens who recognized the atrocity of the crime. Dr. King himself delivered a eulogy at one of the services, witnessing the profound impact this single act of hatred had on the national consciousness. Despite the immediate identification of Cherry and his co-conspirators as suspects, justice would not come swiftly. The FBI had conducted an investigation, compiling evidence and documenting the involvement of Cherry, Robert Edward Chambliss, Thomas E. Blanton Jr., and Herman Frank Cash. Yet bureaucratic obstacles and the inaction of Director J. Edgar Hoover left the case stalled for years. Hoover's refusal to share the investigative findings with prosecutors meant that charges were delayed, allowing the perpetrators to live freely while the victims' families waited decades for accountability. In the meantime, Cherry moved to Texas in the early 1970s, seemingly attempting to build a life removed from his violent past. He married multiple times, fathered 15 children, and worked a series of ordinary jobs, blending into society even as the crime he had committed remained unresolved. Yet the shadow of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing never left him. Over the years, renewed efforts by Alabama Attorney General Bill Baxley and the recovery of previously unreleased FBI documents brought Cherry back into the spotlight. Testimonies from estranged relatives, including his ex-wife and granddaughter, revealed that Cherry had boasted about his role in the bombing, claiming he had lit the fuse. These statements, combined with newly discovered evidence, built a compelling case that would eventually lead to his arrest and trial. When Cherry finally stood trial in 2002, the courtroom was filled with tension and the weight of history. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man motivated by racial hatred, a violent individual determined to strike a blow against the civil rights movement by targeting a church that symbolized hope and progress for the African American community. A key moment in the trial involved a videotape showing a young Cherry participating in a white mob attack on civil rights leader Fred Shuttlesworth. The footage froze on Cherry as he struck the minister, brass knuckles in hand, cementing his long history of violence and prejudice. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Cherry maintained his innocence, claiming he had done nothing wrong. "This whole bunch lied all the way through this thing," he told Circuit Judge James Garrett, expressing disbelief at the verdict that would soon seal his fate. The jury, consisting of 9 whites and 3 blacks, ultimately convicted Cherry of 4 counts of murder, sentencing him to life in prison. For the families of the 4 girls, the conviction brought a sense of justice long denied, a resolution after nearly 4 decades of waiting. Cherry's co-conspirators had met similar fates. Robert Chambliss was convicted in 1977, Thomas Blanton Jr. in 2001, and Herman Frank Cash died before he could be charged. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing had left scars not only on the victims' families, but on the broader Birmingham community, inciting violence and further unrest. On the day of the bombing, 2 more African-American youths lost their lives amid the chaos that followed. 16-year-old Johnny Robinson was shot by police while throwing stones at white motorists, and 13-year-old Virgil Ware was killed by 2 white teenagers on a motor scooter. The bombing also exposed the deep-rooted systemic racism in law enforcement and government, as officials like former Birmingham Police Commissioner Bull Connor attempted to deflect blame, suggesting African Americans might have staged the attack to provoke sympathy, or citing the Supreme Court's desegregation rulings as the true cause of unrest. Cherry spent his remaining years in prison at Kilby Correctional Facility in Montgomery, Alabama, where he died of cancer on November 18, 2004, at the age of 74. His death closed the chapter on one of the last remaining perpetrators of a crime that had shaped the trajectory of civil rights in America. Christopher Thomas Johnson. Christopher Thomas Johnson's story is one that shocks and horrifies in equal measure. Born on December 26, 1972, in Escambia County, Alabama, Johnson would later commit an act so violent and incomprehensible that it would forever mark him in the annals of American crime. On February 18, 2005, Johnson killed his 6-month-old son, Elias Ocean Johnson, in the family home in Atmore. The murder, brutal and deliberate, was fueled by hatred toward his wife, Dana Johnson, and a desire to escape the responsibilities and perceived threats she represented. Johnson's actions were calculated, chilling, and in full view of the law once the crime was discovered. That night, after several failed attempts to silence his son, Johnson laid on top of Elias, smothering him with his hand for extended periods, forcing his fingers into the infant's mouth and down his throat, and striking him repeatedly, all in an attempt to quiet the crying child while Dana slept. When Dana awoke, she found Elias unresponsive and cold to the touch. The forensic pathologist would later testify that the baby suffered at least 85 separate injuries, including blunt force trauma to the head and suffocation, injuries so severe they could not be explained as accidental. Johnson's testimony at trial confirmed his motives. He killed Elias not in a fit of temporary anger, but because of a deep, enduring hatred for his wife and a refusal to be entangled in threats of alimony or child support. He claimed that Elias's death was a direct path to avoiding confrontation with Dana, framing a crime driven by self-interest and malice. The aftermath of the murder was a chilling blend of confession and methodical preparation for the consequences. Johnson represented himself during portions of the trial, a rare and startling choice that revealed both his disregard for the legal process and his desire to assert control over his fate. He waived the traditional appeals process, signaling his acceptance, or perhaps his demand, for capital punishment. Johnson's choice to represent himself was scrutinized closely by the court, which ensured that he understood the full consequences of self-representation. The court documented that he was aware of his rights, the dangers of foregoing counsel, and the near certainty that his death sentence would be upheld. Johnson's IQ, educational background, and criminal experience demonstrated that he was capable of making an informed decision, and he insisted on controlling every aspect of his trial and appeal, reinforcing the cold deliberation behind his actions. The trial itself was brief in terms of jury deliberation, but intense in its emotional and evidentiary weight. Prosecutors presented harrowing testimony from medical experts, detailing the extent of Elias's injuries, including contusions, bruises, ruptured blood vessels, and bite marks, and outlined the suffocation and blunt force trauma that led to his death. Witnesses described Johnson's own confessions, including his admission that he had intentionally caused the child's death to prevent further conflict with his wife. The jury had little difficulty in reaching a guilty verdict, returning a sentence of death after deliberating for less than 30 minutes. During the penalty phase, Johnson offered no evidence in mitigation, instead urging the jury to impose the death sentence, an almost unprecedented request that underscored his desire to control not only the life of his child, but also his own fate within the justice system. In the years following the sentencing, Johnson remained steadfast in his refusal to pursue appeals, a decision that placed him on a rapid path to execution. He was housed on death row at Holman Correctional Facility, where he spent less than 6 years awaiting execution, a remarkably short period compared to the average death row inmate, who can spend over a decade in appeals and review. In those final years, Johnson's conduct remained consistent with the cold, detached demeanor that marked the murder itself. On the day of his execution, October 20, 2011, Johnson's final meal consisted of a turkey bologna sandwich with tomatoes and cheese, French fries, and an orange drink, along with a Reese's cup, pretzels, and grape Sunkist from a vending machine. He spent the day with his brother, Thomas Eugene Lagos, who would also witness the execution, and engaged in brief conversation, reportedly discussing the Bible and Johnson's sense of repentance for the pain he caused. As the lethal injection began, Johnson's final words were simple, chilling, and emblematic of his controlling nature. Game over. He was pronounced dead at 6:25 p.m., completing a crime and punishment arc that unfolded over 6 harrowing years. Andrew Reed, lackey. On the night of October 31, 2005, the quiet streets of Athens, Alabama, were illuminated not by the glow of jack-o'-lanterns or the laughter of children in costume, but by the shadows of an approaching horror. Inside a stately brick home on North Hines Street, 80-year-old Charles Newman, a retired building contractor and World War II veteran who had stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944, was about to face a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Newman, a widower, lived alone in the house, estranged from his son, but connected through memory and loyalty to his grandson, Derek, a young man who had known Andrew Reed Lackey since childhood. On this Halloween night, that very familiarity would prove deadly. Andrew Lackey, then just 22, had no criminal history, no apparent motive beyond desperation. But in his mind, a path to quick wealth had been laid out. The belief that Newman had a vault filled with cash and gold. It was this belief, fueled by stories he had been told by Derek, that led Lackey to plan a robbery that would end in unimaginable violence. Lackey's approach to Newman's home was unremarkable on the surface, polite even, according to later reports. But behind the veneer of a young man who once sold items online and maintained a quiet life in Huntsville, a storm of violence was brewing. It is believed that Lackey forced entry through the back door of the home, encountering the elderly veteran inside. Armed with a .38 handgun, he confronted Newman, demanding the location of the vault. Newman, displaying the courage and composure that had defined a lifetime of service and survival, managed to place a call to 911. On the recording, the operator could hear Newman attempting to reason with the intruder, his voice calm but firm. "Come sit down and let me pray for you." His words were not just a plea. They were an attempt to reach the humanity in the young man he had known as a friend of his grandson. What followed was a struggle that would leave the house soaked in blood and change the lives of everyone involved forever. Newman, though frail with age, was not defenseless. He grabbed his own firearm, and shots rang out inside the den. Lackey, reacting with lethal ferocity, attacked Newman with a knife, stabbing and slashing more than 70 times, leaving the tip embedded in Newman's skull. He also shot the elderly man in the chest, ensuring that the struggle ended in death. Despite his injuries, Newman fought to the end, embodying the courage that had defined him as a soldier and a man of principle. The scene investigators would later describe was chaotic, horrific, and deeply tragic. A home turned into a battlefield where age and experience were no match for desperation and violence. After the murder, Lackey attempted to drive himself to the hospital, carrying the very wounds inflicted by the man he had come to rob. He was forced to stop for help on the way, and an alert employee called authorities. Lackey was arrested without further incident and received medical attention for his gunshot wound, yet he refused to disclose how he had been shot. Police found a bloody knife and his handgun in his car, along with evidence linking him to Newman's blood via DNA. The pieces of the crime scene, combined with the 911 call, painted a stark picture of a robbery gone fatally wrong. A young man, known to the family, turning a moment of trust into one of the most brutal homicides the town had seen in decades. Lackey's trial began in 2008, and the gravity of his actions quickly became evident to the jury. The prosecution laid out the sequence of events with precision: the forced entry, the confrontation, the shooting and stabbing, and Lackey's attempts to escape justice. During the proceedings, it emerged that Lackey had once been a friend to Derek Newman, that he had lived a relatively quiet life, and that his turn to violence was as shocking as it was incomprehensible. The defense sought to explain his behavior through psychological evaluation, highlighting that Lackey showed signs of autism and was taking multiple psychotropic medications. His parents took the stand, pleading for leniency and describing a son who, though troubled, was capable of love and social connection. The jury, however, found the calculated brutality of the murder and the premeditation involved in the robbery outweighed any mitigating factors. On April 3, 2008, Andrew Reed Lackey was sentenced to death. He had by this time already made the decision to forego appeals, writing directly to the Alabama Supreme Court to request an execution date. Prisoners' rights groups, including the Equal Justice Initiative, argued that Lackey was mentally ill and had not been properly evaluated before waiving his appeals. They contended that his mental state, shaped by autism and medication, should have prompted further investigation before allowing him to end his own legal battle. Despite these appeals, courts ruled that Lackey's request could proceed, and the wheels of justice moved inexorably forward toward his execution. The years on death row were quiet, punctuated by brief visits from family and the occasional correspondence with other inmates or advocates. Lackey's mother, father, brother, and aunt were present on July 25, 2013, the day of his execution, sitting silently as he faced the culmination of his legal and personal decisions. In the sterile room of Holman Correctional Facility, Lackey lay strapped to a gurney. Warden Gary Hetzel asked if he had any final words. "No, sir, I don't," he replied. A chaplain knelt by his side, offering a prayer, while Lackey took several deep breaths, seemingly drifting into a final, quiet sleep. At 6:25 p.m., Andrew Reed Lackey was pronounced dead. His last meal had been a simple comfort: grilled cheese and bologna sandwiches with French fries, a mundane ritual before the extraordinary finality of execution. Lam Luong. On the cold morning of January 7, 2008, in Mobile County, Alabama, a tragedy unfolded that would shock the nation and leave a small fishing community in disbelief. Lam Luong, a Vietnamese refugee who had arrived in the United States as a teenager, reportedly loaded his 4 young children into a van and drove to the Dauphin Island Bridge. His children, Ryan Phan, 3, Hannah Luong, 2, Lindsay Luong, 1, and Danny Luong, just 4 months old, were innocent bystanders in a storm of anger, substance abuse, and marital strife. By the end of the day, all 4 would be dead, thrown one by one into the icy waters of the Mississippi Sound, an act that defied comprehension and set in motion a legal battle that would stretch for years. The children's mother, Kyu Fan, testified later that the argument leading up to the murders was intense and that Luong had been struggling with drug addiction, unemployment, and infidelity. The family had temporarily relocated to Georgia after Hurricane Katrina devastated their home in Bayou La Batre, only to return months later to rebuild. But the pressures of life, addiction, and personal turmoil appeared to have taken their toll. In the immediate aftermath, Luong reported his children missing, telling authorities that a woman named Kim had taken them. It was a story that seemed implausible from the start, but it bought him a brief window of public sympathy. Police, however, quickly discovered inconsistencies. Within a day, Luong confessed to investigators that he had killed his children, throwing them from the bridge in a chilling act of revenge against Kyu Fan, his common-law wife. Volunteers launched an exhaustive search across Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, scouring coastlines and waterways for the tiny bodies. Over a 2-week period, the children were recovered one by one. The youngest, 4-month-old Danny, was found near Port-au-Prince. 3-year-old Ryan was located in Bayou La Fourche. 1-year-old Lindsay near Jose Bay, and 2-year-old Hannah was discovered over 100 miles away in Venice, Louisiana. Each recovery brought unbearable grief to the family and community alike, a stark reminder of the horrors committed on that fateful morning. The crime sent shockwaves through southwest Alabama. Hundreds of volunteers took to boats, aircraft, and shorelines, desperate to recover the children, while the community struggled to understand how such a tragedy could occur. The public funeral, attended by over 600 people, became a somber focal point for collective mourning, with handmade memorials, cards, and gifts flooding the Bayou La Batre Community Center. The grief was palpable. For a small community, the loss was incomprehensible. Lam Luong, 38 at the time, faced the full weight of the legal system. He initially pleaded guilty to capital murder, acknowledging the horrific nature of his acts and requesting the death penalty. In a handwritten note, he stated, "I no longer want to live, but I don't know how to die," signaling a disturbing resignation to the consequences of his actions. His defense attorneys, Greg Hughes and Art Powell, had attempted to argue that Luong was battling addiction, depression, and the after-effects of a turbulent past, including his difficult childhood in Vietnam, where he was ostracized for being of mixed race. They urged the court to consider life imprisonment without parole, highlighting mitigating circumstances. However, the court found the aggravating factors overwhelming. Circuit Judge Charles Graddick, who presided over the case, instructed prison officials to show Luong daily photographs of the 4 children while on death row, a grim measure underscoring the severity of the crime and its impact on the victims. The jury convicted Luong in March 2009 of capital murder, and the court sentenced him to death, a verdict met with both relief and horror by the community, who struggled to reconcile the image of Luong as a father with the horrific acts he had committed. Throughout the trial, testimony painted a portrait of a man who had once appeared affectionate toward his children, but had descended into a life marked by drug abuse, unemployment, and infidelity. Witnesses described his erratic behavior, long absences from home, and increasing detachment from his children, foreshadowing the violence that would come to define that January morning. Kyu Fan recounted that Luong had a girlfriend and often disappeared for days, returning home only to resume the cycle of argument and neglect. On the day of the murders, 3 of the children were not even dressed for the cold morning, while Ryan, the eldest, was the only one properly clothed. Their mother and extended family tried desperately to search for the children, initially believing Luong's fabricated story that someone else had taken them, but soon faced the unbearable truth. The appeals process further complicated the case. In February 2013, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Luong's conviction and death sentence, citing significant pretrial publicity that saturated the Mobile community and prejudiced potential jurors. Judge Mary Wyndham recused herself, and the court ruled that Circuit Judge Graddick erred in denying a change of venue, as extensive media coverage had influenced public perception of Luong's guilt. Only 15 of 156 potential jurors had not heard of the case, and polls suggested that 71% of those familiar with the story believed him guilty before the trial even began. The appeals court also noted other procedural errors, including the denial of funds for defense investigators to travel to Vietnam, inadequate Vietnamese language interpretation during the trial, and the improper use of a police demonstration involving sandbags dropped from the bridge. Despite these legal challenges, the horrific nature of the crime remained unchanged, and the community continued to grapple with the devastating loss of 4 young lives. Lam Luong's actions not only ended the lives of his children, but left an indelible mark on the hearts of those who knew the family and the countless strangers who followed the case nationwide. His name became synonymous with tragedy, a chilling reminder of the destructive potential of anger, substance abuse, and untreated personal demons. The aftermath of the case prompted conversations about the vulnerability of children in domestic settings, the psychological impact of refugee experiences, and the importance of mental health interventions for families under stress. While the courts wrestled with procedural fairness and due process, the memories of Ryan, Hannah, Lindsay, and Danny lingered, memorialized not only in cemeteries and memorials, but in the collective consciousness of a community forever changed. Bruce D. Mendenhall. Bruce D. Mendenhall, an Illinois long-haul truck driver, appeared to the world as an ordinary man, married with 2 daughters, and living in a small home in Albion, Illinois, surrounded by farmland. Neighbors recalled a man who kept to himself, often sitting silently in his semi-truck while his wife conducted mundane errands, showing catalog items to local residents. To those who encountered him, he was slightly different, a little cold, but fundamentally ordinary. A man with a steady job and a family, the kind of man you wouldn't suspect of harboring a dark secret. Yet beneath this mundane exterior lurked a predator whose crimes would shock multiple states across the Southeast. Mendenhall's story took a sinister turn in the summer of 2007, beginning with the murder of 25-year-old Sarah Nicole Hulbert at a Nashville truck stop on June 26th. Detectives quickly realized the scope of the danger posed by Mendenhall when, on July 12, 2007, Detective Sergeant Pat Postiglione spotted a yellow tractor trailer matching surveillance footage from the night of Hulbert's death. A routine inspection turned into a chilling discovery. A large plastic bag filled with bloody clothing, a rifle, knives, handcuffs, latex gloves, black tape, cartridges, a nightstick, and sex toys. DNA analysis later revealed the presence of 5 different women, hinting at a serial killer's horrifying trail. Arrested immediately, Mendenhall's calm demeanor betrayed nothing of the terror that investigators had begun to uncover. He quickly became the prime suspect in multiple murders of women, mostly young prostitutes, across Tennessee, Indiana, and Alabama, with police later expanding the investigation to include Georgia, Illinois, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas. The first confirmed confession came from Hulbert's murder, followed by admissions regarding Samantha Winters, 48, whose body had been discovered in a trash can at a Lebanon, Tennessee truck stop. Lucille Gretna Carter, 44, was found dumped nude with a plastic bag over her head in Birmingham, Alabama, while 31-year-old Karma Purpura vanished from Indianapolis, leaving only DNA evidence linking her to Mendenhall's truck. Each crime painted the picture of a methodical killer who used his long-haul routes as cover, selecting victims from vulnerable populations and using his truck as both a hunting ground and a transport for his grim trophies. Investigators noted that some victims were shot, others left in trash bins, some mutilated with parts taken as macabre souvenirs. Each act revealed a chilling evolution in Mendenhall's methods, a man adapting his killings to remain one step ahead of law enforcement. As police dug deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Mendenhall's crimes were not limited to opportunistic killings. While incarcerated, he plotted further murders, attempting to hire inmates to kill 3 witnesses and even 2 detectives involved in his case, showing a cunning mind willing to manipulate others to continue his spree even from behind bars. In February 2010, these plots resulted in a 30-year prison sentence, a rare measure of justice for an individual whose violence threatened to expand far beyond his confirmed crimes. The life of Bruce Mendenhall stands as a stark reminder of the evil that can hide behind the facade of normalcy. Despite his seemingly ordinary life in Albion, complete with family and familiar routines, he used his occupation and mobility to stalk, kill, and terrorize. His arrests and subsequent confessions exposed a dark network of crimes that spanned several states and claimed multiple lives, some of which are still officially unresolved. Victims like Sarah Hulbert, Samantha Winters, Lucille Carter, and Karma Purpura were silenced violently. Their lives abruptly ended at the hands of a man whose outward appearance belied the depths of his depravity. Law enforcement's meticulous investigation, led by detectives like Pat Postiglione, was instrumental in piecing together the breadth of Mendenhall's crimes, from forensic evidence in his truck to DNA matches linking him to unsolved murders and disappearances. Each step in the investigation revealed not only the horror of the individual killings, but also the systematic nature of Mendenhall's operations, how he exploited his role as a long-haul driver to access vulnerable women across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation extended to potential connections in Georgia, Indiana, Tennessee, and beyond, including missing women like Deborah Ann Glover and Letitia Yvonne Milliken, whose lives intersected tragically with Mendenhall's path of violence. While some charges, like the solicitation of murders against detectives, were dropped, Mendenhall's convictions for murder for hire and solicitation confirmed a persistent willingness to perpetuate violence, a testament to the enduring danger he posed. Through trials and investigations, the case of Bruce Mendenhall unfolded as a chilling narrative of a predator cloaked in normality, a man whose outwardly unremarkable life hid a lethal obsession that left dozens at risk. His crimes highlight the vulnerabilities faced by marginalized populations, particularly women in precarious circumstances, and the crucial role of vigilant policing and forensic science in stopping such predators. Evan James Miller. On the night of July 15, 2003, a quiet trailer park in Lawrence County, Alabama, would become the scene of a tragedy that would shock a community and spark a legal battle that reached the United States Supreme Court. Evan James Miller, just 14 years old, and his 16-year-old accomplice, Colby Smith, were not hardened criminals, at least not in the eyes of those who knew them. They were troubled teenagers, each carrying the weight of fractured families, neglect, and psychological struggles. Yet on this night, they committed an act of violence so extreme that it would alter the course of their lives forever. Cole C. Cannon, a 52-year-old neighbor who had only recently moved into the country living trailer park, would become their victim. Cannon, a former owner of a baseball card shop and an avid collector, had just settled into his new home when the teens targeted him, first for robbery, then for murder. The sequence of events began innocuously enough, or so it appeared. Cannon, who had been drinking, came over to the Miller trailer asking for help with a meal and spent some time talking with the boys. That night, Miller and Smith sought to obtain drugs and cash from Cannon, but failed. Instead, they stole a portion of his baseball card collection, an act that would set off a chain of events, culminating in his death. As the evening turned into the early hours of July 16th, Cannon returned to his trailer. Miller and Smith, now emboldened, returned with the intent to incapacitate him and take what they could. They played drinking games, smoked marijuana, and gradually rendered him unconscious. When Cannon awoke and resisted, the situation escalated beyond anyone's imagination. According to trial testimony, Smith grabbed a baseball bat and struck Cannon on the head, while Miller assaulted him with his fists. The violence continued relentlessly. Miller, at one point, placed a sheet over Cannon's head and told him, "I am God. I've come to take your life." He then struck him repeatedly with the bat, ensuring that there would be no chance for survival. Afterward, the teens returned to their trailer, but the night was far from over. They came back to Cannon's trailer to attempt a cleanup, but the damage had been done. In a desperate and calculated effort to erase evidence, they set fire to multiple locations within the trailer, including the back bedroom, the south bedroom, and several couches, ensuring at least 3 points of origin. The fire would eventually claim Cannon's life, though the blunt force trauma he had suffered played a critical role in his inability to escape. Firefighters who arrived later found blood spatters on walls, a coffee table, towels, and a pillow, painting a harrowing picture of the struggle that had unfolded. Cannon's body, discovered in the hallway leading to the back bedroom, bore signs of multiple rib fractures and contusions, evidence of the brutal beating before the flames consumed the trailer. Toxicology reports revealed a blood alcohol level of 0.116, further complicating his chances of survival. The investigation quickly turned to the two teenagers, with evidence and eyewitness accounts establishing a damning narrative. Miller's own statements, initially inconsistent and evasive, eventually outlined the sequence of events that led to Cannon's death. He described retrieving the stolen wallet and cash, the altercation with Cannon when he was confronted, and the final blows dealt with the baseball bat. Smith's testimony corroborated much of this, detailing the repeated trips between the Miller and Cannon trailers, the escalation of violence, and the deliberate setting of fires to conceal the crime. When authorities examined the scene, they found multiple points of origin for the fires, bloodstains consistent with the victim's DNA, and items missing from Cannon's trailer, including his wallet and baseball cards. The autopsy revealed that Cannon did not die from the fire alone. The blunt force trauma, compounded with smoke inhalation, was the ultimate cause of death. The brutality and premeditation of the act meant that Miller, despite being only 14, would be tried as an adult. The trial drew intense attention, with an all-female jury, mostly mothers, weighing the evidence. Miller's defense argued that he was a troubled teen, suffering from drug dependency, mental health issues, and a chaotic family life that had left him incapable of adult reasoning. His mother, Susan Miller, testified about his history in foster care, previous suicide attempts, and ongoing psychological struggles. But the prosecution painted a starkly different picture. A calculated, violent act driven by greed, reckless disregard for human life, and a level of awareness sufficient to justify adult charges. When the jury returned its verdict, the weight of the evidence left little room for doubt. Evan Miller was convicted of capital murder during the commission of first-degree arson and robbery. On October 20th, 2006, at 17 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that would later fuel a landmark legal challenge. Eric Robert Rudolph. Eric Robert Rudolph, born on September 19, 1966, in Merritt Island, Florida, would become one of the most notorious domestic terrorists in American history, earning the chilling moniker, the Olympic Park Bomber. His acts of terror between 1996 and 1998 left 2 dead and more than 150 injured, spreading fear across the southern United States. Yet, The path that led Rudolph to become a fugitive, a criminal mastermind hiding in the Appalachian wilderness, began with a deeply troubled upbringing. Rudolph's father died when he was just 15, and he moved with his mother and siblings to the remote Nantahala region of North Carolina. His mother, an ardent survivalist, homeschooled him and instilled a worldview rooted in self-reliance, suspicion of authority, and a rigid ideological framework that would later influence his descent into extremism. Rudolph briefly attended public school before dropping out and working as a carpenter with his older brother, Daniel. Although he tried attending Western Carolina University for a short period, he ultimately found structure in the military, enlisting in the U.S. Army in 1987. Yet even there, his path was troubled. He was discharged in 1989 while serving with the 101st Airborne Division, reportedly for marijuana use. His stint in the military, brief as it was, provided him with rudimentary skills and discipline, but it could not contain the growing radicalization and violent tendencies that had begun taking root. By the mid-1990s, Rudolph had retreated into a life of isolation, operating off the grid, living in the forests of North Carolina, and developing skills in survivalism that would later make him one of the FBI's most elusive fugitives. His ideology, reportedly influenced by the Christian Identity movement, a radical white supremacist sect, framed his violent acts, although Rudolph himself later denied deep allegiance to any specific group, insisting he acted in the name of his own anti-abortion and anti-government beliefs. The first of Rudolph's known attacks came on July 27, 1996, at the Centennial Olympic Park in Atlanta, Georgia, during the Summer Olympic Games. Thousands had gathered to celebrate, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. Rudolph planted a sophisticated pipe bomb filled with nails and screws shrapnel, designed to maim and kill indiscriminately. Inside a knapsack, security guard Richard Jewell discovered the bag and began evacuating the area, yet the bomb detonated before it could be fully secured. The explosion killed Alice Hawthorne, a 44-year-old mother visiting the Olympics with her daughter, and injured 111 others. Melih Uzunyol, a Turkish cameraman who rushed to the scene in a bid to help, suffered a fatal heart attack. The blast shook the nation and became an international story, not only because of the timing during the Olympics, but also due to the sheer audacity and calculated cruelty of the attack. Rudolph's stated motive, revealed years later in court, was to embarrass and anger the federal government over its tolerance of abortion, although he claimed he intended to harm only government workers. Yet the victims of his bombs were ordinary civilians, families, and bystanders, a tragic testament to the indiscriminate nature of terrorism. Following the Olympic bombing, Rudolph struck again. On January 16, 1997, he targeted a women's clinic in the Atlanta suburb of Sandy Springs, setting off 2 bombs, one inside the building and another in the parking lot an hour later, designed to hit first responders and emergency personnel. 6 people were injured, some permanently, highlighting his cruel methodology of targeting not only intended victims, but those who came to help them. In February of the same year, Rudolph bombed the Other Side Lounge, a lesbian nightclub in Atlanta. One device failed to detonate, but another injured 5 people, marking Rudolph's campaign of terror as both persistent and geographically widespread. His final known attack occurred on January 29, 1998, at the New Woman All-Women Health Clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. This bombing claimed the life of off-duty police officer Robert Sanderson and critically injured nurse Emily Lyons, cementing Rudolph's reputation as a cold-blooded murderer. His bombs, always crafted with nails and dynamite, were designed not just to kill, but to inflict maximum suffering. The manhunt for Rudolph became one of the most intense in American history. Identified first as a suspect in the Birmingham bombing in 1998, Rudolph was officially placed on the FBI 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list on May 5, 1998, becoming the 454th fugitive to earn the distinction. With a $1 million reward for information leading to his capture, federal authorities scoured the Appalachian wilderness, where Rudolph was believed to be hiding. He became a ghost, a phantom in the forests of western North Carolina, evading capture for more than 5 years. Local sympathizers and extremist groups, drawn to his radical ideology, allegedly aided him. Songs and T-shirts glorified his flight, and he became a figure of fascination in white supremacist circles. Despite his ability to live off the land, Rudolph relied on occasional trips to civilization for supplies, which ultimately led to his capture. On May 31, 2003, a rookie police officer in Murphy, North Carolina, found Rudolph scavenging for food behind a grocery store. Unarmed and surprisingly calm, Rudolph did not resist arrest, bringing to an end one of the most prolonged domestic terror manhunts in U.S. history. Following his arrest, Rudolph faced a series of federal and state charges for the Atlanta and Birmingham bombings, including multiple counts of homicide and malicious use of explosives. He entered a plea agreement to avoid the death penalty, admitting guilt in exchange for life imprisonment. On August 24, 2005, Rudolph was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms, plus 120 years, and ordered to pay $2.3 million in restitution to victims of his attacks. During his sentencing, victims and their families recounted the trauma and loss they endured. Alice Hawthorne's family, in particular, described their grief over her death at the Olympics, finally finding some measure of closure as Rudolph was sentenced. Hawthorne's husband and daughter spoke directly to Rudolph in court, condemning his cowardice and exposing the false bravado behind his ideological justifications. Rudolph's smirks and muttered responses during testimony revealed a chilling lack of remorse, though he did issue a brief apology for his crimes. He is now serving his sentence at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado, sharing a facility with other infamous criminals, including Theodore Kaczynski, Richard Reed, and Terry Nichols. There, Rudolph spends 22 hours per day in an 80-square-foot concrete cell, effectively isolated from the world he once terrorized. Thomas Warren Whisenant. Thomas Warren Whisenant, born January 29, 1947, in Pritchard, Alabama, would grow up to become one of the most notorious serial killers in the state's history. His life and crimes spanning decades of violence, manipulation, and tragedy. Whisenant's childhood was marked by dysfunction and control, dominated by a mother whose overprotectiveness and authoritarian presence shaped much of his early psychological development. His father, Willie Whisenant, a weak and alcoholic man, offered little stability or guidance, and much of the household's tension fell squarely on Thomas's young shoulders. He slept in his mother's bed until he was nearly 7, continued to share her bedroom until he was 16, and was shielded from all consequences, creating a deeply dependent, fearful, yet resentful child. Psychiatrists later described his victims as mother substitutes, women upon whom he would project the complex and unresolved feelings he held toward his mother, a domineering figure whose control over him had long-lasting effects on his capacity for normal emotional development. By his teenage years, the mild, compliant child began to display moodiness, irritability, and violent tendencies, a prelude to the horrific acts that would later define him. Whisenant's criminal history began in adolescence with minor assaults, purse snatchings, and incidents involving young girls in his community, but law enforcement at the time never formally charged him. Early signs of serious psychopathy emerged when, at the age of 16, he was implicated in the shooting of an elderly woman, an event that left police concerned but unresolved due to his family's intervention. His time in the Air Force added further complications. Whisenant was convicted of attempting to murder a fellow member and exhibited psychotic and paranoid behavior even during his brief military service. Experts later concluded that these formative experiences, coupled with his family environment, stunted his psychological and emotional growth, leaving him with a warped understanding of control, power, and intimacy, which would ultimately culminate in murder. The series of murders for which Wijsenhant would be convicted began in 1975 with the killing of Venora Hyatt, a woman abducted and murdered in Mobile County, Alabama. Over the following months, he claimed another victim, Patricia Hitt, and finally, on October 16, 1976, he committed the crime that would lead to his arrest: the abduction, rape, and murder of 23-year-old Cheryl Lynn Payton, a convenience store clerk and mother of two. Wijsenhant kidnapped Payton from the store where she worked, driving her to a secluded wooded area. There, he sexually assaulted her in the front seat of his pickup truck before shooting her in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. The initial murder took place in a field, after which he dragged her body into the trees and returned the next day to further mutilate her, removing a section of her breast and slitting her abdomen, acts that were chillingly sadistic and deeply symbolic, echoing the unresolved psychological conflicts of his youth. Observant locals and law enforcement soon narrowed in on Wijsenhant. He was captured after being spotted near the scene of Payton's murder, leading authorities on a tense chase through the woods. Once apprehended, he confessed not only to the killing of Payton, but also to the murders of Hyatt and Hitt, providing detailed accounts of the crimes and confirming suspicions about his prior attacks. The investigation revealed that these acts were devoid of any financial or personal motive. Wijsenhant did not know his victims, nor did he speak to them extensively during the abductions. His crimes were marked by a disturbing silence and methodical mutilation, suggesting a ritualized compulsion rather than impulsive rage or passion. Wijsenhant's arrest and subsequent trials spanned decades, complicated by questions about his mental health. Defense attorney Richard Cohen spent 23 years challenging Wijsenhant's death sentence, arguing that he was a psychotic, paranoid schizophrenic whose childhood trauma and untreated psychiatric conditions rendered him mentally ill. Evidence from federal prison doctors during his military service supported claims of severe mental instability, but prosecutors countered that many individuals endure dysfunctional upbringings without resorting to murder. Ultimately, courts determined that while Wijsenhant's background contributed to his pathology, he was aware of his actions when committing his crimes, and mitigating circumstances could not absolve him of responsibility. During his time on death row at Holman Prison, Wijsenhant's life took on a strange routine of isolation, reflection, and limited human contact. He spent hours reading the Bible, corresponding with visitors such as Mara Tillman, whose uncle had helped arrest him, and other friends and advocates. Despite decades of incarceration, his compulsions persisted in prison. He was known to possess and mutilate images of women, echoing the same patterns seen in his victims. In his final hours, he requested a last meal of chicken leg quarters, French fries, American cheese, orange drink, coffee, and chocolate pudding. He declined to speak before the execution and showed no apparent remorse, actions that deeply angered and distressed the families of his victims. On May 27, 2010, at the age of 63, Thomas Wijsenhant was executed by lethal injection after spending 32 years, 8 months, and 20 days on death row, the longest anyone had waited in Alabama for execution. Dressed in white and strapped to the execution bed, he remained silent, offering no final words. Witnesses described a tense, emotion-filled atmosphere, with some observing subtle gestures from Wijsenhant, interpreted as defiance or indifference. For the families of Cheryl Lynn Payton, Venora Hyatt, and Patricia Hitt, the execution provided no comfort, only the grim closure of seeing the man who had taken their loved ones' lives meet his own end. The state of Alabama recorded Whisenant as its 241st executed prisoner, but the psychological scars left by his crimes lingered far beyond the sterile walls of Holman Prison.